Boy, does time sure fly when we're having fun because here we are at yet another FSMA Friday. It's the only way to kickstart your weekend. My name is Jim Albright, and today we are going to look at ways to strengthen our food safety and supplier evaluation procedures, starting with agriculture and then moving into manufacturing. But before we begin, I see we have some new FSMA friends joining us today, so welcome. We're very glad you're here. FSMA Friday is our monthly series that's brought to you by Safety Chain and the Acheson Group to provide some regular updates, insights, guidance around the changes happening in the Food Safety Modernization Act. And we like to keep things conversational here, which is why we're encouraging interaction with all of our industry experts who present each month from the Acheson Group. Now, this is your chance to learn all about new methodologies and tools that can help you consistently meet FSMA requirements and keep your customers safe and happy. So please do participate with your questions and comments. All right, just a few housekeeping items. We've muted all attendee mics, but as mentioned earlier, we are leaving room at the end for Q&A. So again, please put your comments and questions at any time during the presentation and we'll do our best to get through them all. But if we do happen to run out of time today and we didn't get your question answered, don't worry, we absolutely will follow up with you after the webinar. And yes, this presentation is being recorded, so everybody who registered will get the recording later today, as well as the slide deck presentation. Okay, I'm excited to welcome to FSMA Friday Dr. Angela Ferelli Gruber, whose experiences range from hazard assessments, food safety plan and culture development, recall and corrective action preparedness, and helping food producers meet GFSI standards and FSMA compliance. So, Angela, it's great to have you with us. But before we get into your presentation, I would love if you could spend just a couple of minutes more telling us about your background and what you're doing at TAG.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi all, my name is Angela Ferelli Gruber. It's great to be with you here today. Produce is my background. I got my PhD from University of Maryland at College Park, go Terps, evaluating foodborne pathogens in agricultural environments. So specifically, I was looking at salmonella and how it interacted with the immune system of tomatoes. And then I was also looking at the diverse amount of Salmonella cerevars and how they interact in irrigation water. So as a food safety manager at TAG now, I assist a wide range of food producers from manufacturers to distributors, helping them devise best-in-class food safety programs.
Awesome. And I know you have a few FSMA updates to share with us today, right?
Yes, I do.
All right, let's dive in.
Perfect. All right, so in terms of regulatory updates I have to share with you today, the first one is that July 6th, the FDA released an updated list of the agency's priority topics to complete guidance documents for in 2023. This year, we've seen the release of some already, like the major food allergen labeling and cross-contact consideration document and action levels for arsenic and apple juice. The agency is hoping for a few more to complete this year, including low moisture food, ready to eat foods. Low moisture, ready to eat foods. Next up, we have July 12th, the FDA released a public inventory of food ingredients that they determined to have unsafe uses in food because they are unapproved food additives. FDA also listed chemicals that are currently under review, and these are links to each of those. I don't know if the slides are shared afterwards, but if you're interested in the links, we can definitely help you with that.
Yep, we'll send everything out right after the call.
Fabulous. All right, last week, FDA issued their conclusions from evaluating third-party food safety systems against the FSMA rules. You can see a table here. They found the following 4 audits here in this table to be aligned to the preventive controls rule in the case of the first 3 and the produce safety rule in the case of the last one. So that was good. And then the last bullet point there, I have that also last week, the FDA denied a petition requesting that the agency reconsider its denial of a citizen petition that was issued in May. FDA stated that the request for reconsideration didn't provide a basis for modifying their original response. And just for some context, that citizen petition requested a ban on the use of 8 orthophthalates and a revocation of the prior sanction uses for 5 orthophthalates in food based on alleged food safety concerns. Last thing I have here that is not on the slide for those in the primary production industry, for those of you who are waiting on the FDA to release the final version of the Ag Water Rule, word is at the International Association for Food Protection conference a few weeks ago that that may be out in Q1 or Q2 of 2024. So keep your eyes on the lookout. Okay, so today we are going to talk about supply chains, and specifically supply chains that use raw agricultural commodities in their product, like tomatoes to make sliced tomatoes, or even salsa, or milled products that haven't been subjected to a kill step yet. So wheat and corn and rice products to make flour. Supply chain food safety programs, or gaining visibility to the food safety procedures and evaluating the practices of how your ingredient is produced for quality and safety, can strengthen your company's food safety system. Further, having an ongoing relationship with your ingredient producer that's centered in food safety and quality will also help permeate the food safety culture throughout your company. So that's going to be our focus today. In some facilities, supply chain programs might be implemented as a preventive control for certain ingredients, and it would be required if the facility has identified hazard requiring a supply chain applied control. For example, if you're not implementing a kill step for the hazard within your facility, like in the sliced tomato example, you're only getting the tomatoes and you're slicing them. As good industry practice and per what might be required of you by the preventive controls rule, your written supply chain program includes how to evaluate, approve, and only use approved suppliers. And essential to this is determining the appropriate supplier verification activities, how you're going to evaluate them, as well as the frequency of conducting those activities and documenting the results, as well as other documentation. So important to note here, when you're an importer and you have a compliant FSVP, some of these items might not be required for you, but it's still good to think about in terms of developing best supplier practices. However, as a person who's not producing the tomato or the wheat or whatever raw agricultural commodity that you're intending to receive, you might find that it's challenging to gain visibility on how far It might be challenging to gain visibility on how folks who are far down on the supply chain manage those risks and what that means for the risk profile of the ingredient when you would be receiving it. So in this talk, I'm going to share with you some of the insight TAG has on how to develop what could be some of the appropriate hazards to look for in some of these ingredients, how to evaluate the risk profile throughout the supply chain before it gets to you, and some thoughts on evaluation or verification activities for these raw agricultural commodities to ensure that your supply program is working effectively. So first, I wanted to talk about food safety on the farm to give a little extra insight to folks on what is done before and immediately after the crop is harvested to support food safety, and how primary producers have to think about and manage risk. So generally, hazards on the farm can be grouped into the following categories. We have humans, water, what soil amendments the farmer is using, sanitation and housekeeping of tools, both in the field and after the crop is harvested, and animals, both in the field and in the pack house. These major elements on the farm definitely affect the food safety and the quality of the outcoming product. So on-farm food safety is centered in implementing practices like these for those different farm elements that might be hazards. So in terms of managing workers, you want to make sure that you have a strong worker training program, managing your water quality, making sure that you have safe use of the soil amendments you're using, especially if you're using something that came from an animal like compost or manure, having a strong sanitation program, and having land risk assessments, wildlife monitoring, pest management to manage that animal component. We focus farm food safety on preventive measures rather than reactive because we've seen through research that preventive measures are significantly more effective in reducing food safety risk with raw agricultural commodities. So, just like food manufacturing facilities, farms usually have food safety plans to help them organize their food safety strategy. Those plans are complete with policies, risk assessments, standard operating procedures, and record keeping, and some examples of which we talked about on the last page. Just like facilities, also farms perform corrective actions and reanalyze their food safety plan when things occur. For farms, some of these events that would trigger a reanalysis or corrective actions would be natural disaster events, including flooding events or other man-made potentially events that could compromise the safety of the field. For example, if you're right next to a cattle farmer and there was a breakdown of the fence between your farm and your field and the cattle field right before you're about to harvest, you know, that's going to trigger some corrective actions. You know, if you have significant animal intrusion, if you find through your washing procedure that you didn't have enough sanitizer in the produce wash system, the farmer finding someone is working on the job when they're sick, or even when the farm chooses to implement new pieces of harvest equipment or a new nutrient management strategy. However, what you might find that is different from the food safety program that you have in a facility is that, especially if the primary producer falls under the farm definition, it's likely that they're not going to have flow diagrams to share with you. They likely don't have a written hazard analysis and may not be familiar with that lingo or preventive controls. They might also not even have a food safety plan, as that's not required underneath the produce safety rule, but it is for third-party audits. So if you're dealing with someone who is under a GFSI scheme, for example, they absolutely will have a food safety plan. So that kind of just reiterates what we have on the slide here. One thing to know about the primary production industry is that if they're growing crops that could be eaten raw, then they may be subject to the FSMA PSR, and they're going to have to take specific training as part of compliance to the PSR. And then what you might also find is they might have one of these third-party audit schemes. Here are a few examples of the GFSI benchmarked schemes that a farm or a primary producer could have. And there's also the USDA technical equivalent of a GFSI scheme. So, all right, as someone who is not a primary producer, talking to the facilities now, or someone who might be a receiver of crop raw agricultural commodities, how do we accurately evaluate the crop RAC, raw agricultural commodity, that we're intending to receive? So one strategy that folks can use if they already know from their ingredient hazard analysis that they need to institute a supply chain preventive control is to do the following, right? We want to understand the hazards specific to the product and the growing and harvesting, etc. conditions. We want to risk rank to determine what could be appropriate evaluation strategies for that producer. Evaluate and approve and establish monitoring procedures. If you're not sure if your product or the ingredient that you want to receive requires a supply chain preventive control, you can also use the first two bullet points to help you determine that answer. So we're going to go through each of these. We're going to start with understanding the hazards. And this begins with thinking about the different features of the crop, as well as the different growing conditions that are in that crop is growing in, because those will definitely help you think about what sort of food safety questions and what sort of practices you need to ask and that you need to see, right? So questions could be, is this producer conventional or are they organic? Are they growing in field or are they doing controlled environment agriculture, things like that. So in terms of conventional or organic, some farms may use different fertilizer sources, and if they do, we will have to evaluate that they're being used safely. Generally, synthetic you'll see used mostly with conventional growers. That's generally accepted as a little less risky. However, you can certainly, as a farm, you can absolutely manage other sources of biological soil amendments in safe ways, but it's a more active management to bring that from the more risky side to the less risky side. So as a supplier who might want to receive food that's being produced with compost or manure, you're going to want to look for, these certain practices, their conveyance and their handling expectations for raw manure and compost, their documentation of application of raw manure and compost into the field, and making sure that they're using acceptable wait times between applying that amendment and the first harvest of the crop out of that field, things like that. And we can help you at TAG determine what those questions are that we need to evaluate. In terms of in-field or controlled environment agriculture, neither of these schemes is hazard-free by any means, right? The profile of these hazards is a bit different because one's inside and one's outside. One main difference I wanted to highlight here is the handling of water. What is the microbial quality of that water? How is the quality of that water managed throughout its use? Generally, we usually think that municipal water sources are a little less risky than open water sources. However, your management and control over the water source can definitely slide this water into either more risky territory or less risky territory. And an interesting thing to note is, folks who are doing controlled environment agriculture, a lot of these people will use recirculated water. So the water at the start of that use might be a different quality than the water 2 weeks into recirculating, right? So being sure that that primary producer has a good management of that water quality throughout its use is really important, right? So we want to make sure that whatever water is touching the edible portion of the crop during growing and harvest specifically, we know the quality of that water, or we have trained our workers to not harvest anything that has had the edible portion of the crop touch water of unknown quality. A little bit more about water, but on the post-harvest side, we know that water is a potential contamination multiplier, especially at and after harvest. So if folks are washing their product, that could potentially be a little more risky than if we're just harvesting the product dry and that's it, right? So if you're finding that the product that you are intending to receive is being washed, you need to ask about how are they managing sanitizer in that wash water? How are they managing batch water changes of that system? And how is the sanitation of that line looking like, to make sure, again, that the quality of the water is adequate for its intended use throughout the use of the water, and it's not subjecting the product that it's being washed into to cross-contamination risk. Okay. So another piece of this puzzle is that some crop RACs are associated with specific hazard, whether they be physical, chemical, biological. This slide depicts a few commodity-specific hazards to think about. This is not exhaustive in any means. With vegetables and fruits, the big three vegetative bacterial pathogens are always on the mind. Your Salmonella enterica, Shaketoxin-producing E. coli, or other pathogenic E. colis, and Listeria monocytogenes. Specifically, Salmonella seems to be able to contaminate anything. It's as the jack of all trades. So, I don't think 8 years ago we would think that onions were particularly susceptible to Salmonella contamination, but here we are in 2023 and we know differently now. Another pairing we see often, or another association, is leafy greens and pathogenic E. coli. So that is a particular pathogen commodity pair to look out for. Hepatitis A has been associated with berries and herbs, and parasites like Cyclospora have also been associated with both of these, herbs particularly. It's super important with this potential pathogen commodity pair to make sure that the worker training and sick monitoring practices, as well as water quality, are really up to par and strong in those primary producers that we're evaluating. For heavy metal contamination, historic ag practices or land use can be potential factors to think about. If the farm is in a city or a previous industrial site, we want to think about how are folks managing that risk in soil. Do soil tests in old orchards specifically, right, reflect high levels of arsenic, which we know has been a component in historic pesticides? Just different things to think about. And speaking of chemicals, mycotoxin are also important things to consider for products like wheat, rice, corn, and nuts. These are toxic compounds that are made from different types of fungi. I have aflatoxin here, made by Aspergillus flavus, but there are others. And production of these is influenced certainly by storage conditions of the grain after it's harvested. So this could be where certificates of analysis can be handy for you as a verification activity for some receiving facilities, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Last to note here, Bacillus cereus, which is a spore-forming bacterial organism, has been associated with wheat. It is in the agricultural environment. It's hard to get rid of, but we can manage handling practices in potentially milling facilities or even in your facility to ensure growth to an unsafe level, which I think the research says about 10 to the 5 CFU per gram. So making sure that growth does not hit high levels, because when growth hits high levels, that's when we have toxic formation. We don't want that. Again, another opportunity potentially for use of COAs if you deem appropriate. Okay, so once you ponder the potential hazards that could be associated with the product you intend to receive, then you can start strategizing what would be appropriate supplier evaluation or verification activities. We at TAG have seen a few different strategies to get to this decision-making process. Today, I'm presenting a points-based system for evaluating crop RACs. Lower scores here are better and result in potentially lower risk. Higher scores might result in potentially higher risk. The different categories here, I chose 4 to look at. The risk of the product category itself, right? Is it something that's not eaten raw and potentially and not historically associated with illnesses and outbreaks? That gives a lower score. However, then we have things over on the right. If it's eaten raw in a product category that historically has been associated with outbreaks, it might be, it has a little bit higher baseline risk. You can choose to look at the risk of producer as well. Firm has not been implicated in a market withdrawal or recall in the past X amount of years, or it has been. Again, with producer practices, firm has passed the last X year audits with no majors or minors, right? And I have X year here because you might not be able to get anything past the first year, but if you can get a historic report of 2 years of audits or 3 years of audits, do so. You'll be able to look at, how the company is growing, because we know that food safety is a continuous improvement sort of situation here, right? So over on the left with lower risk, we have, audits are passed, no majors and minors, and then it goes all the way up to farm has potentially failed an audit within the last years, and farm has no third-party audit. I have the little exclamation points here because this might be a deal breaker for you all. Or you can choose to do your own audit on the system if you are a certified auditor. But this is definitely a red flag to look out for if they do not have a third-party audit. You can certainly help them get to that place, but just pointing it out here might be a little more risky. In terms of quality issues, this could be helpful for suppliers that you're reevaluating year after year. It's important data to capture here, especially if you have been working with someone who either has not given you any quality issues, right? That's definitely something important that you want to capture, or if they're on the other spectrum. Good information for a total program assessment here. Want to go back to this slide, my bad. Okay, so you can use something like this during your ingredient hazard analysis to determine if you need a supplier preventive control. For example, if you're going through this and you are evaluating everything at 0, an important question to ask your team is, do we really need a supply chain preventive control instituted for this particular ingredient? But if you've already determined that you need a supplier preventive control, then you can also use this to determine appropriate verification activities for approval and also ongoing monitoring. So we're going to get into those verification activities here. So remember, on the preventive controls rule for human food, if you identified that you need a supplier preventive control, one or more of the following must be conducted before initial use of that product and periodically thereafter. But aside from federal requirements, these verification activities are good industry practices. They are annual audits or review of supplier relevant food safety records like harvest assessment, worker training, water tests, things like that. Also, you can utilize certificates of analysis, which may be appropriate for some ingredients. And then I have other here as well. In terms of audits, right, you can choose to perform the audit yourself if you're certified, or to evaluate an accredited third-party audit from the supplier. Remember, for hazards that cause serious adverse health consequences or death, an annual on-site audit is required from the preventive controls rule. Example of third-party audit schemes benchmarked for GFSI are ones that I have already mentioned: Global GAP, SQF, Primus GFS, etc. And you can also use FDA inspection results if the primary producer shares them, would like to share them with you. To evaluate an audit, you want to look for not only the majors and minors, but read the whole narrative report, and we'll go into that in a few slides. In terms of other, we'll go over that as well at the end. And then just want to note that there are some exceptions to this verification activity requirements under the preventive control rule for human food. Remember, a receiving facility is not required to conduct verification for things that are a very small business or a farm that grows produce that isn't subject to the produce safety regulation. However, good industry practice to still put them through your supplier evaluation scheme. Okay. So we can use the risk ranking model that I shared a few slides ago to determine the need for certain verification activities. For example, which ingredients are going to require your company to do a boots on the ground audit, and which do you feel comfortable performing a desktop evaluation of a third-party audit? We know that boots on the ground audits is definitely the best way / gold standard to gain visibility to a program, but it's not always economically feasible, and it's certainly probably not to do this for all of your ingredients. So as you can see in the example, when you sum the scores or sum the numbers from the risk ranking table, you're going to receive a score, and lower scores indicate potentially lower risk, where a desktop review of a third-party audit might suffice. Higher scores may indicate that you might need to go see yourself, and extremely high scores might trigger an escalation in decision-making process within your team on if you should move forward with that potential supplier. Questions can be changed in the risk ranking score approach to give quantitative data to inform other types of decisions too, like do you want to use COAs or not as part of your verification activities, or do you need to evaluate other food safety records to get a total picture, or is the desktop audit fine and would suffice? When reviewing an audit or conducting your own, pay close attention to how the farm elements that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk are managed on the farm. I recommend not just looking at the audit majors and minors, but reading through the whole report, as I previously stated. And a few things to highlight here: irrigation, right? Adjacent land use, manure use, worker training. So in irrigation, what's the source? How is water quality managed? What protections are in place? Are there any non-conformances with water tests, and have they been addressed? You can see in this example here, we had some potentially major findings on the water source. This was a well that was with no cap on it. How are workers trained? Is there an incentive program for folks to report or self-report when they're sick? That's usually best industry practice. It helps folks feel comfortable to say that they're not able to work. Adjacent land use. This is a fun one. I usually go on Google Maps for this. Some audits will give you growing coordinates, and you can look for nearby animal operations or CAFOs and industrial facilities, wastewater treatment plants. If there are any industries that are adjacent to or within the vicinity of the farm that has the potential to compromise the field or the water quality. Are there any shared or adjacent roads? In this case here, we have sheep, and the next over here out of the picture was a field, right? So what are the barriers that the farmer is put in place, and what sort of non-conformance / corrective action plan do they have when inevitably some sheep will cross this barrier? Soil amendment practices. Are they using untreated amendments of animal origin, or even are they using biosolids? So that is treated, or it should be treated, human waste. If so, make sure that they're following all applicable regulations. Do they have the right documentation for using these amendments? Does it look like it's being managed in a safe way if your boots on the ground taking a look at it? Pesticide use, are they using, are all chemicals that they're using approved for use for the crops for the intended country of import? Some things to think about. And if you're evaluating an audit of a pack house attached to a farm or a warehouse that does wash and repack, or even grain milling and storage, some specific questions to think about here is, are products harvested dry? Are they washed? What's the washing procedure? How is sanitizer managed? How are the workers trained? Again, are the facilities in good shape? Does pest control look like it's working, or do we have some issues there? Storage practices of the agricultural commodities, right? Especially for those commodities where storage that is less than ideal can result in mycotoxin formation. So we want to make sure that that is well managed for things like wheat and rice and corn. And then, sanitation, right? This is really well evaluated when you can see the equipment and you can see if it's been cleaned adequately. But even looking through the audit can give you some indication of what's going on there. I have read audits before where different warehouses were potentially introducing a chemical hazard to the food that they were working with because they were cleaning food contact surfaces with 2000 ppm bleach, which is a lot, right? So just making sure all that kind of checks out as you're reading through or as you're on site. Okay, so now we're going to talk about COAs and when you can use them to your benefit. So written ingredient specs should be developed for all suppliers, although you might find that it's uncommon if you ask for it from some produce suppliers. Verification of compliance with those specs is recommended for ingredient classes that have a history of contamination, and adherence to specs is commonly confirmed through the use of certificate of analyses or COAs. COAs are a good option to manage some chemical contaminants, so something like aflatoxin, and they might be harder or potentially more limited to be useful for things that have more sporadic contamination, like, for example, sampling bulk crop produce coming in for hepatitis A, right? That it's very hard to find. So yeah. So to discuss COAs, I decided to use the management of aflatoxin as an example here, where the facility that receives cornmeal could ask for a COA for aflatoxin, and the testing would be done by someone like the miller who is turning the corn into cornmeal. And the farmer of the corn is expected to follow, good agricultural practices and good storage practices of that product. So if you are choosing to use COAs as part of your verification strategies, some good questions to ask are the following. Ask about the sampling procedure. Does it make sense for the lot size, or are they just taking like a 25-gram sample for a lot that's like 5,000 pounds? Think about how useful that is. Is it a representative sample? Is the lab that is doing the testing, are they accredited? Are they following AOAC or other standard methods? Does the COA that you receive give you numeric results, which is highly preferred? And is the limit of detection of the assay known, right? We want to make sure that the limit of detection of the assays are sufficiently low enough so that they can quantitate what you need to know to make sure that the product you're getting is within your specification. Are you going to request the COA for every load or less frequently? That is a good question to discuss with your team and think about the recall implication of the frequency that you intend to choose, right? So you might not be able to get it every load, but doing it every year, right? If you get a non-conformance on that yearly test, what does that mean for how you're using the product, your clean breaks within your facility? What does that mean for how much you're going to have to, get your arms around? And then also think about who's going to evaluate the COAs, what are the critical limits for acceptance, where's it going to be filed, who has visibility to it, things like that. All right, so in terms of other things that you can do to evaluate potential suppliers, you can look into the outbreak history of a commodity to sort of get a better feeling of the baseline risk for that commodity. Here are two resources for you to be able to do that I used. On the left here, we have the National Outbreak Reporting System dashboard. That here you can get an Excel sort of printout of different foodborne outbreaks, and you can look at what commodities are associated with them. I would recommend unchecking everything except for foodborne here, because you're going to get outbreaks that are just out of scope for you. On the right, you have the FDA core investigation updates. You can get email updates of these, which I have. It's really nice to keep up on the information. You can also look at peer-reviewed reviews on Google Scholar for commodity-associated pathogen pairings and, you know, the up-to-date information on that. Different other ways to evaluate the supplier, right? If the place that you are intending to receive from is a facility, if they're required to register with the FDA, you can look them up on firm search here. This will tell you past inspections of that entity, past recalls, and if they were class 1, 2, or 3. And you can also sign up for another email push, which I have, which I like, is FDA recalls, market withdrawals, and safety alerts. And this will give you email updates. So important just to note here that involvement in a recall doesn't necessarily have to result in the automatic disqualification of a potential supplier that you're thinking about, but you're going to want to understand the circumstances of the recall and the corrective actions and the preventative actions that the company's put in place to determine and factor that into your approval decision and your verification activities too. All right. So remember, if you have a supply chain preventive control for this specific ingredient, the following is required. But for those of you that don't, this is also good business practice. You want to make sure that you're approving suppliers and that it's documented before receipt of any loads of ingredients. You also want to monitor at unloading, and if this is supply chain preventive control, these procedures have to be written, and monitoring has to be documented as well. Different things that you can do at receipt is record the supplying company and ensure that every load comes in from a firm on the approved supplier list, and you can check to match BOLs with your approved supplier list for that one. You also want to, you know, other good things for monitoring is check that the receiving truck is of adequate sanitary quality. There's no mixed loads of something that can potentially jeopardize the safety of your product. And you can also take a peek to look at product integrity before you approve receipt. Re-approval or verification must be done periodically. We recommend yearly, and in some cases, this is going to be required yearly to reapprove your suppliers. In terms of documentation, if you have a supply chain preventive control, the following is required, but as I have been mentioning, this is also good business practice. So you have a written supply chain program, you have written identification of what you use to do your supplier approval activities and your verification and ongoing monitoring, documentation of when suppliers are approved, your receiving procedures and monitoring records of the receiving procedures, and FSVP related documents if you are the importer. So in summary here, we chatted about crop, raw agricultural commodities and their supply chains. I hope to give a little bit more insight into both sides of that coin to help both industries work together to, you know, have a strong food safety system from farm to fork. We talked today that crop, raw agricultural commodities have some varied risk profiles, and that's influenced by the commodity itself and its growing, harvesting, and packing conditions. Food safety teams can follow a stepwise approach to determine appropriate supplier evaluation activities. And if you are sitting there thinking you need some assistance with your supply chain program, TAG can help.
Wow, so much information in here. Angela, this was amazing, incredible. I have so many pages of notes already. This was great. Thank you so much. I think I'm just going through the list of questions that we're getting in. Yeah, there's quite a bit here. One thing that really popped out for me though personally was you made a comment earlier about how farms aren't necessarily regulated. Obviously, we know that by certain FSMA requirements or other types of requirements unless they have raw products. But it's in everybody's interest that they themselves maintain good safety practices and they document those practices. So I'm just curious, are you seeing that actually happening as a best practice on the grower level? Or is this an area where growers need a little bit more training and understanding?
Thank you for so much for that question. So yeah, even though folks who produce products that are not normally eaten raw, for example, like potatoes, right? If there was an outbreak to happen, FDA still has the ability to require you to recall that product, right? Because everybody is still covered under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So we do know that folks who are producing things that are not normally eaten raw, they still have the option, and many do still have, GFSI benchmarked third-party audits so that they
Mhm.
can show the rest of the industry that they are doing everything they need to do to make sure that they're producing a strong, high-quality product.
Right. Obviously, that helps build value for the thing that you're creating or producing when you're showing that proof. And I know again that goes back to things you said. Well, you don't always are going to have a certificate of analysis or other types of documentation. So, I may not do business with you if you don't have these certain now hopefully benchmarks for doing business. So, where have you seen, what typical scenarios have you seen where there's this unseen risk, right? You mentioned sanitation, water quality, even worker training. What seems to be the biggest culprits in terms of high risk?
In terms of ag practices.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, I think that the toughest one is is worker training, but it's not from a lack of trying. I think worker training is still really hard to get our arms around to develop these training practices and develop relationships with workers so that they feel comfortable telling folks when they're sick, and you know
Right.
and they feel comfortable, yeah, with that communication. And also another piece of this is making sure that workers are empowered on the farms, so that they have all of the facilities that they need to be able to execute their jobs to the best of their abilities and the most safely, right? So
Hmm.
I worker training is definitely the thing, and worker training is also a food safety culture piece, right?
Right.
if
Exactly.
you if you're not if you show a video, or if you do like a 1 hour training once at the beginning of the season and then expect everybody to be good for the rest of the season,
Yeah.
that might not be enough, right? Making sure that food safety, even if it's like tailgate talks 10 minutes each at the beginning of every day before we go out on one topic or another topic of food safety, doesn't always have to be food safety, but keeping it at the forefront is a big food safety culture strategy to ensure that training is really executed effectively.
Yeah, and I'm going to segue over to the, we'll say, manufacturing side because there obviously is a training or culture issue still happening for a lot of folks probably on this call. You mentioned inspecting the truck when it comes in. I mean, that right there, may not be the job of the person receiving the product or the raw materials and then putting it into where it needs to go. So they obviously need to be trained and coached on a regular basis on where to look, what types of things or conditions should they be aware of as they take that pallet or whatever it is that's holding the materials off of that truck. Are
Yep.
there other, on the manufacturing side, are there other examples that you can provide in terms of, inspecting raw product coming in?
Oh, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Especially if you are a facility that's going to be doing any like washing or chopping of that
Yeah.
raw product. So this is like more specifically probably tuned to the folks who are working with vegetables and fruits, right? Um, Letting workers know that it is a good practice to look at the product before you're sending it in for the chop or you're sending it into the
Mm,
wash. If you're seeing stuff in that bulk load where, for example, like a bin full of cucumbers is heavily deteriorated, or where there, there's cracks in them and some stuff has leaked out of some of them, right? I've seen before, like cucumbers that have been ready to go on the floor and the box is broken and the cucumbers are like kind of 6 inches from the floor. We don't want to put that the into the stream of manufacturing. So I think it's everybody's job, like on the floor, right? If you're going to be chopping it or washing it, or even if it goes, even for some instances, even if it does go to a kill step, right? The kill step's not going to get 8 logs of everything. We want to make sure we're putting in high quality stuff so we get out a high quality product. So everyone should be trained to take a look at things, and
right.
when things look bad, don't use it. If things are close to the floor, if they've got condensation drip on them, either from the truck or from when they're staged, don't use it.
Yeah, not just an FSQA product. It's anybody that is on the floor. Be observant. Look to see
Mm-hmm.
the quality of the product is what you'd expect it to be. You had a slide around fertilizer, an example that you were talking about fertilizer risk. And I think you had said that if you, for example, you were changing fertilizer consistency or some type of modification of your fertilizer, you should notify the manufacturer you're doing business with. On the manufacturer side, where would they be able to find information about something like that? Or is it just expected that the farm would notify them proactively?
The farm should probably notify them if they're making any really big changes. So, for example, if they're changing like from using a thermophilic composted product to something where they're using an untreated manure, right? So that significantly changes the risk profile. Um, but where manufacturers can go to learn more about this, Cornell, uh, Produce Safety Alliance has really great resources and is a
Hmm,
really great landing page to learn about different risk profiles of fertilizer, but and other biological soil amendments of animal origin, but also a lot of other different agricultural elements um, that affect the safety and quality of the product. Other really good groups who have a lot of information on biological soil amendments of animal origin. USDA ARS in Maryland, headed by Dr. Manan Sharma. He has done a lot of work on biological soil amendments of animal origin in conjunction with many land grant universities. So that can also be a place where Google Scholar can help you learn a little bit more about the risk profiles.
right, right. Um, you talked about, or at least you mentioned an example of flooding events. So eh, it's up to the farm to take the preventative action, but as a manufacturer, how would you assess, say, weather or type of environmental factors in terms of doing business with a producer grower? So you may obviously live in an area that's prone to, say, flooding or something to that effect. Okay, that's fine. But there's also these weird instances that happen throughout. And again, it's up to the farmer, the grower, to have that preventative plan and notify their suppliers. But again, nothing's ever so foolproof as we'd like to believe. So, do you have any advice for the manufacturer in terms of how to assess growers or other suppliers around things like weather or other environmental factors?
Absolutely. There are spots in folks' third-party audits, growers' third-party audits, that require growers to have plans for some of these events. So in some cases, reviewing the audit will help you get to that information. But this is also where the manufacturer it would behoove the manufacturers to have a little bit of insight uh, of to where the product is grown and the potential risks that might be associated with that area. And if you don't, like if you don't know that it's grown on the East Coast and it's susceptible to hurricanes, right? Or it's grown in the Midwest and susceptible to big tornadoes, you could just ask, right? Has the farm had had to deal with any natural disasters like flooding in the last year? and farms should have a plan for that. And this is, when I talk about flooding, it's specifically when waters of the state overflow their boundaries, right? So a
Right.
field kind of getting socked by too much water, that's a different thing. We're really talking about when we have a river, creek, something has overflown its banks, overflown its banks and has
Mhm.
reached the field.
All right, that makes sense. This one's going to be maybe a too broad of a question, but I like it, so I'm going to ask it. I think you already gave an example here, and that is, hey, if you're growing a product that can be consumed raw, you fall under the same or similar categories as, say, a food producer. But what are some of the differences between are sorry, what are the differences between food safety plans at farms versus food manufacturing facilities? Again, I know that's a very, very broad question, but maybe you can provide some additional examples.
Sure, yeah. So in general, they're shorter. As I had mentioned in the presentation, you're likely not going to see if it falls under the farm definition and they don't they're not they don't have a component where they're a facility, they're likely not going to have a process flow diagram. They might not have a hazard analysis table, right? They likely won't. They still will have SOPs and monitoring records. Um, they might have more risk assessments, written risk assessments done um, for things like their land use, um, using biological soil amendments of animal origin,
Right.
uh, their how they choose to use water, right, for different applications like fertigation or irrigation and things about their water source. So those are the general differences of how you're going to see that it's different.
Okay. Yeah, and I know you brought some of those up in your presentation too. So I'm getting some questions here. Will the webinar be shared? Absolutely. We will absolutely follow up with you with the link to the recording. I'm going to do a little tag pitch here because you had so many good questions to ask, whether you're at the farm or a manufacturer. Different questions that you should be asking to verify and validate that you are doing things safely, as safe as possible. Is there content or some other resources from TAG that has a lot of these questions built in, some type of maybe checklist or something that you can offer?
Oh, that's a great question. We do not have anything available to share at this moment, but perhaps if that would be something that folks on the webinar are interested in,
All right.
we could work on that.
All right. I'm going to flash up the website here for the Acheson Group so that you can reach out to them and start that conversation because that would be awesome to get some
Mhm.
type of list. Also, as you can see here, the Acheson Group has a bunch of food safety insights and resources that you can tap into. Safety Chain also has a few that you can also check out at our downloads page. Angela, we're going to wrap it up today, but I would definitely love to have you come back because, again, this was chock full of goodness, and I'd love to carry the conversation. So thank you for coming on and giving us the introduction. This was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for sitting with me during your lunch hour on a Friday. It's been fabulous.
All right. Well, with that, everybody, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next month on our next FSMA Friday. Happy weekend, everyone.